Hello, everyone. I'm Liz Farrell, Artistic Director of Painting, Drawing, and Printmaking in our Artists in Residence program. So welcome to Anderson Ranch's Visiting Critic Lecture Series with artist Baralaye. I want to welcome our virtual participants watching tonight as well. And before we begin, if you could please silence your cell phones, that'd be great. And for our land acknowledgement, I want to recognize that the Anderson Ranch campus resides on the historic tribal lands of the Ute people who've called this area home for over 800 years. In honor of this legacy, we focus on building an inclusive community here, maintaining this as a place for inspiration and creativity in the center of the Rocky Mountains. Baralaye is a ceramicist, sculptor, and educator. His work explores objects, texts, bodies, and patterns abstracted through a diaspora lens and the aesthetics of craft. Ebby's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally. He is currently an assistant professor in ceramics at the College for Creative Studies in Detroit, Michigan. So please join me in welcoming Ebby.
Hello, everyone. Let me get to the right slide here and play. Nice. I want to thank you, Liz, for that introduction. It's really a pleasure being here at Anderson Ranch. I'm usually here in the summer as a part of the mentorship program that I co-teach in ceramics with Del Harrow. One of our students have come out, our mentees have come out today. It's great being here in the summer. There's like a real kind of like buzz to the energy of all of the students and classes that are going on, but the kind of the chill atmosphere that's here now with just the residents and getting to go around today and do a number of studio visits was really pleasurable. So thank you for this invitation. Thank you to Emil, Laura, Betsy, again, Liz, for allowing me to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work after having really great conversations this afternoon with a number of the artists here. I'm looking forward to the other half of conversations tomorrow. But yeah, it's really a pleasure for me to get to now share a bit about what interests me as a creative person, working in clay, but also working in a number of different media as well. I tend to bounce around a lot during talks. I like to think of these talks as conversations with myself, with you all. But I would say that a couple of themes that I'm going to touch on throughout my talk are going to be ideas of materiality, home, and immutability. So these are things that I'm going to kind of loop back to as I bring up certain slides and go through specific things. I'm starting my talk with this quote by James Baldwin from his essay, The Creative Process. I like to read this every year. I feel like it's a really kind of formative document for me because it kind of grounds the reality that we live in as creatives and artists in society, and it's a refreshing reminder to me of what it is I'm doing when I'm in the dark recesses of my studio for hours and hours and hours. Mainly, this awareness that as creative individuals, we're waking ourselves up to realities that society would rather forget. James Baldwin talks about these sort of impossible or extreme states in existence, birth, life, and all the messiness of things in between. In fact, one of my friends from Detroit just had his father pass away just this afternoon. So we live in this reality, in this existence where, you know, we're just constantly subject and vulnerable to things going very, very, very much wrong, not only with ourselves, but also in the, you know, physical reality that we live in. When you think about it, we're on this kind of thin layer, sandwiched in between, you know, like a bed of lava, if you go far down enough, and then above us, this vast, lethal expanse of space that wants to kill us. And here we are, nestled. And if you think even that layer is a comfortable place, it really is not. One of the things that's really beautiful about this environment are the mountains that we're surrounded by. But those mountains are evidence of a very distinct kind of violence that's happening over, millennia, hundreds and thousands of years of the earth shifting and moving, sometimes very slowly, but sometimes in certain situations very quickly, as we see with some of the natural disasters that have been happening not only in our country, but really around the world. And here we are, we kind of exist in this space of impossibility. And it's our responsibility as artists to not be afraid of that, to be okay of reminding the world of that, and to make art in the face of that, to draw attention to the things that matter and are important in light of that. And again, if you haven't read through James Baldwin's creative process, I very much encourage you to do so. Clay, in this space of deep tension, this kind of crust that we live on, that's constantly moving and being acted upon, is almost this invitation to order. So when, from an anthropological sense, you see evidence of pots or any sort of, or statuettes, essentially you see society trying to order itself, organize itself amidst the disorder that I'm describing, that we're kind of living within, and on making sense of not only the organization of society with, pots for transporting food and, water, ways of taming the land, but also ways of kind of understanding our metaphysical and spiritual relationship with the world through figurines, through statuettes, all of these things which are sort of a way or a desire to kind of make sense of the things that surround us in this world. There's kind of a double phenomena in ceramic work, where it's this inversion of the minerals, the oxides, the things that are below our feet, into work, into pieces that we get to see and enjoy and experience in the round, with our hands, with our eyes, in waking life, sort of, erupting out of the world. But then there's also the less visible phenomena of how these materials are brought out of the world itself, how they're mined. To the right is an image of a kaolin mine. You can kind of see the mark, maybe not so much just due to the industry of art, but due to a number of other industries that are way bigger than the art industry. We're really kind of carving the earth in order to make available clay in many different forms for us to be able to work with in studios, but also in various factories. So I'm very much aware of that double phenomena. At once, we're kind of making things that come out of the ground, but we're also digging and scarring the earth in order to make those resources available for the type of expression that's so important to us as creative people. With this show, this is my last exhibition at David Klein Gallery in Detroit. I was really thinking about that relationship that we have to the earth as this host for us as human beings, this place that carries our sense of civilization, that carries our literal beings as bodies. I also had the opportunity too long ago, about maybe 2 months ago, to travel to New York City. And there I viewed a really great exhibition that displayed a number of Egyptian artifacts alongside Yoruba statuettes. And what really stood out to me in that juxtaposition was specifically the sarcophagi that was present in this exhibition. And I've made a number of sarcophagi in this exhibition at David Klein Gallery. Here are the sarcophagi that I've made, and you can see one to the left. And then if I hop back a little bit, you see two flanking on either side of this pill-shaped plinth. The sarcophagi are kind of top down instead of flat. But I was really intrigued by the way, I guess, the relationship that the Egyptians had to death and the ways in which they used material as a means of solving, if you will, this kind of insistence on the immutability of the soul, which I think, perhaps to a certain degree, we all hold the same understanding that We desire to believe and think that after we die, we're going to persist in some way. And the Egyptians kind of took that to a really meaningful extreme in creating sarcophagi to preserve the body, to preserve this sense of the self persisting beyond the afterlife. But I was really drawn to how material became the vessel for that transformation, the vessel for that kind of transference where something which breaks down quite easily, our flesh, is kind of cocooned into a material that's going to outlive us all. So all of the ceramic elements that I make in my studio, all of the wonderful ceramic objects that I saw today in the studios here at Anderson Ranch, and including a number of the other materials that you all are working with here, these things are going to outlive us in a way that's going to speak about us, speak about each and every single one of you as makers, but also us as humanity. So I'm really drawn to how this kind of desire of immutability is really mediated by the materials that we work with, the materials that we create every day in the studio, and the materials that are still being dug up after hundreds and thousands of years from the earth in representation of people that lived that long ago. I also think of the vessel of the body itself. I'm 40 years old, and I'm very much aware at my age of how my body has changed from naturally from birth to where I am now, the ways in which it's developing and the ways in which it's breaking down. But thinking about the body as a host and everything that means, from the way I take care of it, the way I navigate through it, and also the way in some form I'm going to yield it when I'm no longer alive. I had the opportunity to travel to China actually last week. I was actually invited by Betsy Allman here at Anderson Ranch to go, and it was a really incredible trip. One of the things that I unfortunately didn't get a chance to do while I was there, not that it was on my itinerary to go, but it's something that I'd like to explore the next time I go back, is view the terracotta soldiers in the Shaanxi province. So these were a number of not only soldiers, but a number of other items and elements made out of clay left behind by the Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who proclaimed himself the first emperor of China in 2021 BCE. So here we have this kind of persistence of not only identity, but also power. The thought here being that Qin Shi Huang will continue to be emperor even far into the afterlife. And if you ever get a chance to see it, it's really like an overwhelming homage to exactly what I'm talking about, how materiality, here specifically ceramics, becomes this vessel for power and identity well beyond the decay or the breaking down or the death of the body itself. I want to share a little bit about my background. I feel like a lot of the ways in which I'm positioning or thinking about my relationship to material and even ceramics itself has to do with my cultural history and how I've navigated that. This piece is by one of my favorite artists, Glenn Ligon, and it for me kind of speaks to a little bit of the duality that I experience of in being a member of the diaspora. So I was born in Nigeria. I was born in River State, Port Harcourt, and I moved before I really developed any memories of being there. Moved to Antigua in the Caribbean, lived there for 3 really beautiful years. The beaches in Antigua are fantastic, and yeah, it's a lovely place to be. And then came to the States. So most of my life has been here in the United States. So as an African person, I'm also an American. I'm a member of the diaspora also as an African American. And so much of how I understand my African cultural identity has been distilled through my parents, my father before he passed away, and now my mother. And it's been interesting for me as a person of the diaspora to kind of think of the tension that exists there. First kind of realized by my desire to, at some point return to Nigeria for my own self-fulfillment and, knowledge, and facing resistance from my mother. Like, why do you want to go back? There are only problems there. Well, it's like, you were born there. I wasn't. I want to go. But I'm also not disillusioned. I'm fully aware of the fact that what it means for me to inhabit space as an individual here in America and be a part of the diaspora here in America is very different from the ways in which I'd be seen and understood if I were to return to Africa, as Glenn Lagon puts. I went to Africa, I went to the motherland to find my roots right. 700 million black people, not one of those motherfuckers knew me. Here we find almost like a comical, but also a really kind of sincere question around that desire for persistence that we saw in Qin Hong with the Terracotta Warriors. Where am I known? And where am I going to continue to be known? I feel like that question is probably answered the most strongly for me in my family members, in my immediate family. I don't have a lot of extended family here in the States, but I have two sisters, my mother and my brother-in-law, and my two nieces. They're all in New Jersey. I'm the only person who's out in Michigan. But they're the ones who are going to know me someday after I pass away, and hopefully, you know, in some way carry on an awareness of who I was and the life that I lived. And I would say the most meaningful form of persistence really is family. Sure, it's great to have, you know, artwork. It's great to be recorded in other formats, but I've been reflecting pretty much ever since my father passed away over the past few years of the significance of not only the family, that the biological family that I have, but the family that I choose to build in the city that I'm in the world that I'm in, as being the grounding force for my sense of self, the grounding force for this sense of persistence that's so important not only to me, but really to all of us. This is another exhibition that I had also at David Klein Gallery called Family Ties. It's an exhibition that I curated and invited artists Shea Burke, Patrick Horm, as well as Patrice Renee Washington to kind of reflect on this idea of family and the ways in which we knit it, both biological and chosen. And I would say, as I'd mentioned before, I was reflecting on this last night, I was preparing for this lecture, that there's no accomplishment greater than connection. And then all of our accomplishments find their greatest significance in connection. So there are many things that I want to do, but nothing's greater or bigger than being known and ultimately being loved. And I know that sounds sappy, but when you get to your deathbeds, tell me I'm wrong. We'll see from there. Another thing that really grounds me as an individual is my sense of place and environment. I talk about home. I mentioned that all of my family's, away in New Jersey, and I'm the one person in Michigan. I feel like throughout my life, being that I've moved quite a bit, home has been significant for me, but home has also been fairly variable in the various kind of cities and states and environments that I've lived in. Something that has been a fairly consistent refuge for me has been my creative practice ever since I was a young child, drawing and playing with Legos, to now, having an art studio. The studio that I have is this very modest one that's pictured. I have a home in the east side of Detroit that I bought in 2020, and the most significant space in that home is this room in the basement, which I immediately designated as my studio. Not at all fancy. You can see here, this is the work that I was getting ready for the Family Ties exhibition at David Klein Gallery. But a really significant place of grounding for me is the place within which I work and create. As you can see, I like to work on a number of pieces at a time and really enjoy how the works exist in dialogue with one another during production. It was really kind of great to see a number of you all working in a similar matter in your studios here today. So I feel like Detroit is a significant place for me as an individual because it's allowed me to have a home and a place where I make my work. It's also the place where I'm a professor, I teach, but just in grounding my practice and my work, incredibly important. I think a lot about this duality, though, as a resident of a city like Detroit, as a Black person, in America, somebody who's of African descent, but also very much an African American that very much benefited from the history of Black people here in America, a history that has been unfortunately touched by the tragedies and the painful realities of enslavement. But I've come here as somebody who's migrated, as somebody who has benefited from that history, is identified also as a Black person, but is also navigating the realities of being an African American in this culture and really kind of thinking about the significance of that. One of the things that I take a lot of pride and interest in are all the ways in which Black people specifically insisted on creating a society and culture for themselves here in this country amidst a lot of oppression, specifically the ways in which they contributed to the arts. One of the most significant forms of that being the development of jazz as well as other forms of music, jazz and the blues. I'm a big fan of jazz and the blues, and it's always been interesting to me how you have a people under such heavy and hard conditions can insist on being creatives, can insist on their individuality, can insist on their beauty, and insist that to the world in the form of beautiful music as well as other beautiful forms of art. One of the individuals that stands out in that regard is David Drake, potter, formerly enslaved potter from the Carolinas region. What stands out about David Drake is that not only was he an artist, but he was a maker in clay who not only made these really beautiful, vessels and works, but also knew how to read. An act, read and write, an act which would have been seen as one of direct rebellion at that time, at the time of his enslavement, but would inscribe these really beautiful words of poetry on his pottery, and that's particularly taken by this one. This, you could see it here in this detail. Well, you can't really read it, but I'll read it for you all. It's an inscription on a storage vessel, and it reads, "I wonder where is all my relation, friendship to all and every nation." It's really perplexing to me because there's at once this very painful tension of navigating the likely sale of his family members to another plantation, to another region, and even in that place of mourning and grief, still wanting to extend friendship to every nation. It almost doesn't seem to make sense, but it's striking to me that David Drake and his creativity and uniquely this position of being an artist and a creative allows him to be forgiving enough and even hopeful enough to think about a life beyond the oppression that he was existing in, and even to be positively sort of hopeful in that space. And I've made a few pieces in kind of response to this history. This is a piece that I've made called "There Must Be a Place," reflecting on David Drake and his position, sort of imagining a time and a point where the oppression that he was living under and the kind of stifling of both his identity and his creative nature would no longer be the case. What's really beautiful is that at the University of Michigan Art Gallery, UMA, there was a show that included a number of David Drake's pieces, also included a number of David Drake's descendants who gathered, and there's a really sensitive video of this, who gathered and just kind of traced David Drake's work. So this kind of moment that Drake hoped for and wondering about all of his relation was realized, now, I guess through that video, through that connection of his descendants gathering and saying kind of like we're here, it's happened, it's been done. I've also produced a piece kind of reflecting or thinking about relatives that I have yet to meet. As I mentioned, I was born in Nigeria, but I really have never gone back. So I think a lot about the various, cousins, half-brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles that I've yet to really connect with. And even though, as I mentioned, in looking at the Glenn Ligon piece, I'm not, what is it? I recognize that I'd be kind of, thought of differently as a person of diaspora there. it is a sincere reflection. Like I actually really long and desire to be able to connect with people that I've not yet gotten to know. The hope is to be able to travel to Nigeria this summer sometime with my mother as my translator. It'll be really interesting to see how that goes. I feel like pottery has been a really kind of important kind of practice in my life. I'm primarily a sculptor, but coming back to the vessel has been meaningful to me throughout my career. I mean, I feel like the vessel represents this opening, ultimately, like the cupping of the hands being the most sort of general or foundational nature of that. And also, like the vessel kind of represents the mouth, if you will, the things that we put into our mouth and things that kind of come out of our mouth. The vessel is this sort of abstraction of that, and I just kind of love how that, as a discipline, becomes this really beautiful canvas for expression. The piece on the far right here is titled "Dream Variations," and again reflecting or thinking or connecting back to this long legacy of other Black ceramicists and potters that have existed and proceeded before me. I kind of made this this piece and dedicated it to the Langston Hughes poem of the same name, and I'm just going to read that poem right now. Again, thinking back to this desire for persistence, but also to a certain degree as I'm navigating as a member of the diaspora and thinking about kind of where I find and position myself culturally, a certain kind of validation in my experience as an individual. So this is Langston Hughes' Dream Variations, written in 1901 to 1967, past to 1967. All right, to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun till the quick day is done. Rest at pale evening, dance, whirl, whirl, a tall, slim tree, night coming tenderly, black like me. It's really that last phrase that kind of really captures me, this idea of what it means to see my experience and my reality reflected in society and culture and the significance of that. I guess in thinking about that, I see the vessel as a body. Here with this piece titled Awoka, I'm kind of reflecting on the killings that we've observed, unfortunately, in the last few years of unarmed Black men being shot, and thinking alongside that of this kind of history and tradition of face jugs here in this country. So traditionally, face jugs would be made with a grimace on them, if you will, like an abstraction of a face expression that one could see as being an abstraction of, like, or a caricature of enslavers or the enslaved, or in a certain way kind of embodying the brutality of, living under oppression, pain, resistance. But also in Yoruba culture, the people which I descend from, the head is believed to be the seat of the soul. So whenever you see a figure represented in Yoruba culture, it's always going to be outsized in some way. So here with this piece, Portrait One, which really began a series of portraits that I started to work on after 2020, I was thinking specifically of that, this legacy of making around the face jug and the way in which the face becomes or operates as the seat of the soul for me as an individual and for my people. I mentioned early on that my father, unfortunately, passed away. His nickname for me when I was a kid was Big Head, because apparently I had a large head as a kid, and I still do have a large head, but meaningfully so, especially if you think of the head as being the seat of the soul. I made this piece shortly after he died, passed away due to COVID. Again, in the wake of the killing, in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and the protests that resulted, and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, and reflecting on the nature of my identity as a Black male in America, and realizing that so much of how I understand that has to do with my relationship with my father, the ways in which I've navigated it. I wouldn't say I grew up being very close to him. Got closer to him as I was an adult, just relating to him man to man. And, before he passed away, I would say it probably was the closest to him, but realized that so much of how I understand what it means to sort of embody my skin as a Black male has to do with everything and everything about who he was. Also realized, especially after he passed away, that he was carrying a lot of our history with him. My father wasn't incredibly forthcoming about our family history, and I always found that a little bit of a struggle. My advice to you all is to go home, have conversations with your parents, and record them because they're not always going to be around. Learn about your history and treasure the very personal stories that only your parents have about your background. I got the opportunity to do that once or twice before my dad passed away, but I was really concerned about the things that would be lost because I'd never hear those stories again after he passed away. Thankfully, my dad, we discovered after he died a big kind of suitcase with a number of different records, both personal related to him as well as related to our family, that kind of filled in a lot of gaps, and that was a really a relief and sort of like a blessed finding because there was so much that I didn't know and so much that I was afraid of losing as a result of losing him. I would say these histories aren't exactly, harmonious as well. What it means to embody Blackness isn't a monolith, for me in America, for me even in Detroit. Walking in the streets of the city, as an individual, like your neighbor is a mystery, a wild card, or potentially a threat until they're known. And I very much realized this when I first moved to the city. I would just kind of randomly walk up to people and introduce myself. They'd be like, first, who are you? And then once they realized that I was just kind of there to say hello, they would kind of like open up. But for me, it was this awareness of like, oh, what it means for me to be Black here in America isn't just one thing. It's various things depending on what region I'm in, heck, even depending on what block I'm in. This kind of gets me to this exhibition, a new realism. I feel like throughout my career, I've navigated, or rather throughout, sort of working as an artist, I've navigated this understanding of abstraction, or this way in which I represent the self. Even how I'm navigating representing these portraits has to do with cultural ideas of, again, the head being the seat of the soul, but also other significant cultural and personal markers that for me are very real. I'm thinking about this tension between ideas of the real, as we understand in Western culture, as being like largely representational, but more significantly defined by the real as what's felt, the real as what it means to navigate both the self and community and environment as being a more significant indicator of what it means to represent the self. And I felt like this show kind of gave me the opportunity to explore that some more through making more of these portrait pieces as well as more vessel works. These are those portrait pieces displayed in Design Miami in 2021. And I've always kind of thought about how my practice exists in relation to design. I was sharing with another RISD alum here how I first started off as a furniture designer when I was an undergrad before transferring into ceramics, and I've always been drawn to, I guess, ideas or thoughts of utility around design, but very much in relationship with the more kind of conceptual and metaphysical ideas that exist around sculpture, and as well as working with, pottery, and how the two come together or exist in maybe in a certain degree of tension in my work. But it was interesting for me seeing these pieces alongside other works that kind of straddle that line between kind of like design and sculpture. When you think about, West African abstraction, you might think a bit of being exactly that, an abstraction. But again, going back to this idea of a new realism, I don't think, for any of the people who utilize, these masks, these costumes, these artifacts of anthropological significance that are from, the African continent or elsewhere that are indigenous to these areas. They're not abstractions, they're objects of utility, and that utility is spiritual, that utility is personal, it is communal. It's not this interpretation of the real, but it very much is the real. And I'm very interested in how that plays itself out specifically in those societies and cultures, how these patterns, how these motifs become ways of understanding and navigating things that are very felt and very necessary or very kind of present within these cultures. Here's a masked figure from Burkina Faso. And you have these figures as objects that are either ushering evil away from a community or ushering in maybe this kind of transformation from childhood to adulthood in community. And these aren't abstractions, these are very kind of palpable and real events for the people of these communities. But I've taken these patterns and thought about how they apply to my life here and now, thought about how they apply to ideas of utility and design here and now, here with this vessel, as well as these vessels here, and thinking about how I'm taking some of these patterns and designs and reorienting them from the plinth to the wall in ways that for me start to represent a certain kind of relationship to land, as well as a certain kind of relationship to the skin. I think a lot about symbols, the different kind of pictographs that I see in West African culture and how they operate as a utility in those cultures. Here, this is a picture of the Apopis, which is an ancient Egyptian demon of chaos, in the form of this serpent that the sun god Ra would have to, from the understanding of Egyptian culture, kind of battle each day in order to create order in society. And here I've created this serpent, not necessarily as a nod specifically to that tradition, but in recognizing how the serpent kind of exists as this representation of good and evil in our society. I think a lot about other traditions that have preceded me within this vein of craft and design, kind of navigating spaces between art and sculpture. I'm particularly interested in the work of Oloway of Ise, who's alive from, active 1904 to 1910. Well, this piece produced in 1904 to 1910, but essentially was a court artisan who went around to different kingdoms and produced these doorways, stools, as a marker of like the power and influence of the different kings that he worked for. And I think to myself, okay, what does it look like? Or what does it mean for me to embody that legacy? I mean, I'm not Oloway of Ise, but what does it mean for me as a person of the diaspora in America to think about how the ways in which I'm working with materials speak to ideas of home, power, and presence? As far as presence is concerned, I feel like my life has been one of really great transience. I mentioned that I've moved around quite a bit, so the folding chair is this kind of like marker of, a lot of that impermanence, if you will. I think about that transience as it relates to clay itself, because clay as a material is constantly changing. Mostly that change is perceived by us as artists working in the studio. We see how the material shifts, bends, breaks, cracks, and is typically thought of as being an unfortunate thing, but it's also a big reality of life. So for me, embracing the performative nature of clay as the piece here was really rewarding and was really kind of illuminating. I spent a lot of time looking at things. I think a lot about this kind of dichotomy of preciousness that exists around materials, especially between internal and external spaces, between domesticity and the public. I spent a few years living in San Francisco, and these are a number of objects that were just out in the public. It's really interesting to me how certain things like this mattress that you see here can at once be this very kind of like precious and intimate object for us, something that we sleep on, we all sleep on every day, but the minute it is outside for any extended period of time, it becomes this very abject, object that you do not want to touch. So this kind of distinct translation that happens across materials really interested me. Unfortunately, San Francisco is home to, well, I wouldn't say unfortunately, but San Francisco is home to a lot of unhoused people. And I noticed that for them, this idea of the external public spaces was home. So these things that I would see, I would think of at first as being trash, and later would realize some of these things were the actual living elements of people who were unhoused that lived around my block. So I'm reflecting into that as I was kind of like mediating or kind of navigating ways in which a clay specifically goes or can go between these spaces of intimacy, between the external and the internal, between the domestic and the public. And I decided to create this series of rings, abstracting my right and left feet as a way of mapping my neighborhood in the Tenderloin. So just kind of went around and used these objects as a way of kind of understanding the block that I lived in. I at first thought this was going to be really weird and really strange, but if you've ever been to the Tenderloin, you realize that there are far more stranger things happening here. But it was a meaningful way for me to kind of shift this intimacy around clay that had always been domestic, and now use it as a way to kind of understand the world around me. While I was in San Francisco, I taught myself how to sew and really became interested in soft sculpture work. I mentioned earlier that the head in Yoruba culture is believed to be the seat of the soul, and ori is the word for that, the head. And afara or bridge and patrita. With these pieces here, I'm thinking about what it means to sort of exist between spaces, where I am, which at that time was San Francisco, but also ideas of my fatherland, which again is Nigeria. I was thinking a lot about, what it means to kind of mute utility, again, going between ideas of design and sculpture. So here, taking this Meiping form that I got the opportunity to see a lot of traditional Meiping vases while I was in China over last week, but choosing to mute that utility by taking away their openings and seeing their skin as being almost like an abstraction for actual skin, an abstraction for the body. It was incredible. I was really fortunate to get to show a number of these pieces at the Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. Thinking with I guess the title of the show, Many Rooms, about this desire for grounding that relates to the John 14 verse, "In my Father's house are many rooms," from the Bible. How am I doing on time? I guess I have a couple of more minutes. One of the other writers, or one of the other things that I reflect on a lot as it relates to environment, is how environment, informs what it is I make and why I make. And I really love this quote by Cecil Taylor that speaks exactly to that. You might think that in our studios, we're kind of in this kind of vacuum, and we're really not. Like, I talked extensively about what it means for me to exist in Detroit and being understood as a neighbor, to being able to kind of navigate space in my home, having my studio there, and everything about place and environment, and everything about place and environment for you all, even in a place like Anderson Ranch, perhaps even especially in a place like Anderson Ranch, affects how you're able to create, affects how you're able to be present and produce. And it's important to not take that for granted, rather to view that as a tool and utility, or rather a benefit in how you're able to be present and make. Sometimes it could be taken for granted, sometimes it could be a challenge. Like, I talked with a few of you about the fact that I lived in New York for a while and felt a need to kind of move away from that city, really love New York, but move away from it as a way of not only maturing more, but allowing my practice and my work to grow more. So I think about that a lot as I'm making, how everything about what I'm making has to do with where I am. There are really kind of interesting ways in which that concern is reflected, specifically in certain kind of legacies of design. These are some molded plywood plinths made by splints made by Charles and Ray Eames. Big fan of their design work, but I think a lot about this concern for utility, in this case, kind of healing, informs the aesthetic of these works, and how I kind of choose that same ability or right in my own work, but in a very different way. This piece is titled Revelator and Dupped Up. And here, I'm not thinking about the utility of healing, but really this kind of utility of connection to the spiritual, this idea of connection to the world beyond, to heaven, if you will. And this redefinition of that iconography in forms or in a type of abstraction that I choose, rather than in one that I inherit. And thinking about that, I do have one kind of personal story. So this piece is titled Ebeji Ori. So in Yoruba culture, there's a high degree of twinning. So I think it's about 20%, and twins are believed to be the reincarnation of deity. So much so that when twins are traditionally born, or rather, when they're born after they die, Ebeji statuettes are created to kind of encapsulate their spiritual energy and continue to be revered in the households where they were. My mother, I thought she had twins. She actually had triplets that passed away prior to me being born, and I think a lot about them, about these lives that didn't happen, about the fact that if they had lived, I probably wouldn't be here because she probably would have stopped having kids. She would have had like 4 or 5 kids at that point, but decided to kind of create this kind of homage to this loss. At the time, again, I thought she had twins, but I guess I'm due to make a third in this series. But here, kind of representing the Ebeji, rather than through these statuettes, or rather through an interpretation of my idea of these statuettes with this plaster and burlap form as well as wood plinths. I think a lot about how I navigate ideas of culture between being here in America and between all the ways in which I think of and value the legacies that I've inherited as being a member of the diaspora, immigrant, somebody who was born in Nigeria. It matters to me to kind of recognize the distinctions that exist there, that I'm not somebody who's practicing indigenous faith, that I'm not somebody who has the same relationship to all of these elements as somebody who's lived in Nigeria all of their life, that I do have a fairly kind of unique but distinct perspective as somebody who's existed in between those spaces, and what it means for me to be honest about that, but also really what it means for me to kind of celebrate specifically this aesthetic legacy that I have, that I see as core in how I see the world and also the ways in which I want to kind of reflect back to the world. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Abby. We're going to take questions now so that folks who are watching online can hear. If you can wait until the microphone gets to you, that'd be great. And feel free to raise your hand, and I'll bring it around. And thank
Don't
you.
be shy.
Abby. Here we go.
Hey, thanks for the talk. It was awesome.
Thank you.
I'm curious a little bit about, across a lot of your pieces, I think there's a presence of like mark making. Like you can still really see, like, for example, in this piece, you leave the kind of slab or coil lines that you use, and I think across a lot of your pieces, you can still see like touch points from where you were physically making the work. And I'm a little bit curious about the importance of that.
Yeah, that's really important and significant to me. I feel like I guess when I was studying in undergrad, I spent a lot of time kind of like fighting the material or the materiality of clay. Spent a lot of time wanting to make things that were, I don't know, smooth or really defined by I would say a more sort of like deliberate sense of intention. And I've very strongly grown out of that, where I would say even early on I recognized and enjoy all the ways in which working with clay is a dialogue between my intention and what the material does. And ultimately, when I'm at my best, I'm really listening to that and responding to it. But also, I would say, I think of process as being a significant part of my aesthetics, and really kind of being honest about how something has been made. Not to say that in some other piece I might not make another choice, but in a lot of my cold built pieces, I leave the seams and I leave the undulations that represent the fact that this has been touched by my hands, in every part of it. And these undulations become, I guess, a conceptual part of the aesthetic that maybe kind of relates to abstraction of like skin and land, as I spoke to earlier, but also for me embody a certain kind of honesty in this dynamic, in this dialogue between myself and the material, that I just like to be made bare rather than masked over or smoothed over, and that continues to be the case for me. Thank you for the question.
Thank you so much. The supports for your pieces are so beautiful, and they really feel like they're part of the story of each one. And it makes sense that you have like a furniture design background. But I was wondering how you could, like, how you approach those, and especially those really tall ones with the twin piece. They're so striking.
Yeah, like these. Um, yeah, I have benefited from my furniture design experience in making those and really thinking about the relationship my pieces have with the whole environment, including the floor, and not just kind of plopping things on a square plinth, but really, I'm thinking about what the base or how the base exists as a continuation of the form, really as the object itself. But these plinths, it was really important for me for there to be no metal hardware visible. So I've specifically chosen a design which I designed of just pegs that hold these legs in place that could easily pop out for transport. So these I would model in CAD, another benefit of, or Rhino, another benefit of, again, having gone through a furniture design education and then just have fabricated. And thankfully, I've come to the point where now I can have much better fabricators myself to make them. But yeah, taking the plinth, the base, and the whole environment into consideration has been a really significant part of all of my work. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you. I would love to hear a little bit more about the experience, or I guess your thought process when you were working. You were working for pieces for the wall at that one point, and maybe the difference between working in the round and making objects that are sitting on plinths, but also are recognizable utility objects. And also, like, I guess in the round, because the circle feels maybe like this infinite work plane, and when a piece goes on the wall, there's like more finite boundaries to it. I'd love to hear just a little bit about the relationship between those two ways of working.
So a big part of how we relate to clay very much has to do with the wall. I mean, literally bricks. We live around various forms of architecture that made out of clay, that are walls, that are ceilings, that are floors, etc. So I think about that a lot, but specifically this work and a number of other pieces that I've produced on the wall were inspired by residency, a kind of an impromptu residency that I took with a friend in the Bay Area in San Francisco, who was a painter. And there was this opportunity for me to show at a place called the Great Highway alongside this painter. And I thought to myself, I'm going to make some pieces for the wall, and I'm going to own that relationship in a way that's kind of different from, bricks, or maybe even thinking of like specifically tile. And for me, it felt obvious at first, really different from the ways in which I approached both sculpture and working with pottery. I mean, for me, it's kind of really engaging how I'm able to think of like mark and form off of the wall versus, in the round. It would seem at first like a limitation, but I found it to be really, really liberating and really freeing. I feel like it's maybe confused some of my, collectors or people who are interested in my work, because it's like they see stuff on the wall and they're like, okay, like what exactly do we make of this? I'm really, interested in returning to the wall as a space that I continue to, activate. Again, in my interest in working with symbols and also text. I haven't shared any text pieces this evening, but thinking about how symbols and text kind of shift in their meaning and sincerity when being represented in clay is something that I find really intriguing, especially working with raw clay. But yeah, it's different. It definitely is different, and I think I got the opportunity to chat with one artist who's making some pieces for the wall here, and it just kind of changes our relationship to the form like almost immediately. But again, I kind of go back to this kind of vast history of ceramics on the wall being a significant part of how we've understood design and mark making as well as structure. And I'm not an imposter there, but I also feel free to kind of play with or redefine what that space means for my work. Okay.
Thank you for your talk. You mentioned, or you talked a lot about your personal relationship with clay and how that specific material, like reflecting on its history and its basically material qualities. But I was wondering for your sculptural pieces, especially in more earlier years, what your relationships was in deciding for individual materials. Also, like, yeah, when do you decide like what to represent with what? You know, like when do you switch from sculpture to clay and back and forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess the question is almost like why clay to begin with, and I recognize for me there's an invitation to possibility that was unique to working with clay that I didn't find the same sort of technical or creative facility with any other material. Came to really respect what it meant to work with wood, work with textiles, work with metal as well. But especially as a young artist, I was just kind of very drawn to the fact, and this is something that I think is, indicative of clay as a material, which makes it so approachable, is like you can put a ball of clay in the hands of a child and they could create something, or you could put it in the hand of a master potter or a sculptor and they'll make something amazing, as I've seen so many amazing works, here today. So there's kind of like accessibility and facility between sort of my intention, sort of my creative ideas and the realization of those ideas. And maybe in part being an impatient person, I can't say that clay is a great material for being an impatient person, because there's so many ways in which you have to have a lot of patience in working with clay. But I just found that my ideas and the things that I wanted to express just found like a natural resonance in that material, in how I was able to build with it, and also in the ways in which I learned to accept, to be patient with it. But I've also, realized, as a number of you all, if not all of you all, on some degree represent, is that you don't just work in one material, and what it means to honestly, or most aggressively, or most successfully kind of work through an idea might mean working through any number of different processes. I feel like that's been important for me to be open to and embrace. And I mean, like with my Abeji, or my Revelator, as well as my Abeji pieces. These pieces don't have any clay in them at all, but clay was a really important intermediary material. So it was a modeling material that then led to these being cast in plaster and burlap. And the final product itself doesn't have any clay in it whatsoever. So I guess in how I'm thinking of like sometimes scale, weight, the kind of presence, resonance, that I want an object to have. I'm comfortable saying or deciding, okay, instead of working with clay, I'm gonna work with this other, material. But also it's like, what do I have available to me? Am I able to produce this in metal? Do I want to produce this in plaster? Do I want to deal with that right now? Is it just easier, more convenient for me to work with clay, which sounds like a cop-out of a thing to say. But I don't know, I feel like that has to do with it as well. Like, you're all in specific environments, and in some places it's going to be easier to work with some materials over others, and sometimes clay is a great choice, and other times it's not the best choice. So I feel like I'm able to be honest about myself in navigating that question, and not just kind of default to clay as what I work in all the time. But I find, again, I tend to just have the most patience and the most interest in what I'm able to articulate through specifically clay.
Thank you so much, Abby. And
Yeah.
thank you, everybody, for your wonderful questions. Abby's been in conversation since 9 a.m. this morning, so I think we're going to give him a little break. But thank you so much for being here, and thank you, everybody else.
Thank you all for coming. Yeah.